Hello and welcome, fellow bookworms and film fans. Welcome to this week's episode of The Contented Narrative, where I will be discussing Rebecca, written by Daphne du Maurier and published in 1938. There are many versions over the years, however, mainly on stage, so I will be looking at the Hitchcock film that was released in 1940. Now, I will be looking at four things as always. I'll be looking at how good is the film, how good is the book, how well is the film portrayed from the book, and obviously, last of all, overall, how good is it completely. Now, do bear in mind that will be spoilers in this episode as usual. Now, the first thing we'll start with the film. So Hitchcock is a master of suspense, which I'm sure you know, and he has done many fantastic films over the years. In fact, he has actually taken to screen three of Daphne du Maurier's novels: Jamaica Inn, The Birds, and Rebecca. So obviously I'll be looking at Rebecca, but who knows, maybe later on in this series I may be looking at another one. Now it's got the perfect amount of suspense for me. The story is one of a lovely, if little submissive American woman who falls in love and marries and moves to England with sort of like the gentry, as it were, like the English gentry. And she moves to the Manderley estate. Now, it has a lovely story, and obviously, because it's Hitchcock, you've got the shadow of the previous sort of like Mrs. De Winter, who's Rebecca, and that's kind of overbearing over everything, but it's not in the way that you think it is. It's not like a ghost or anything like that. It's not, a jump scare. It's sort of like more, the servants are like, well, this is how Mrs. De Winter did it. And when there was a ball, well, this is how Mrs. De Winter did it. And it's always, well, this is how she's done it. So this poor little American woman hasn't got a clue what's going on. The suspense through the film is mainly from the head of the staff, Mrs. Danvers, because you've got her. She's obsessed with the previous Mrs. De Winter, and you've got strange behaviour from Maxime De Winter as well. So in true Hitchcock fashion, there's something going on, but when everything is revealed at the end, it's not what you expected it to be. And it is really, honestly, there's no one like him. He just does it brilliantly. And I always enjoy his films. I would recommend this film to anyone who likes to sit on the edge of their seat, sort of like wondering what's going to happen next. Now, do bear in mind, obviously, I adore, films of every genre and every decade. But this is a black and white film, so sometimes people might be put off by the fact that it's a black and white before they go and watch it. Now, the book. Now, I was pleasantly surprised by the book. It took me a little bit of time to get into, and I think it is mainly because the main character, our heroine, Mrs. De Winter, I find it really hard to sympathise with her, because I suppose at the time that's what women would have been like. They would have been a little bit submissive. They would have been like a little bit sort of like unsure of themselves, especially if they're going above their class. But for me, I was like, have a backbone, like literally stand up to this woman. Like she can't do anything without your say so. Now, she was like a simpering child at many points, and I feel like she probably is just above the age of childness. Like, it is mentioned like how quite young she is, so I'm thinking maybe she's like 19, 20 or 21, and so for her, sort of like, it is kind of like an early thing there. And she was in the shadow of the late Rebecca, and the maidservant Mrs. Danvers. So Mrs. Danvers always made sure that she was feeling out of touch and that she didn't quite know what was going on, and she was always trying to make her feel foolish as well, which worked quite well. Now, it is a great ending. It doesn't have a great ending. It is a great story, but it has a very abrupt ending. It sort of like ends and you're kind of looking for the next chapter, but it is the end of the story. Like, there's no sort of like ambiguity or anything. That is how it ends. So you sort of sat there going, even though it's abrupt, you're like, I kind of get it. It is the end of the story. So I did still feel satisfied with this book. And honestly, Michael bought this book for me. Because it is one that he wanted me to do on the channel, and I'm really glad that he did, because I would give this book a 7 out of 10. So the plot. Now, they both start in the same way. So they both start with the main girl dreaming that she's back at Manderley. However, the house and the grounds have been reclaimed by nature, and there's not much there anymore. And she kind of, it goes into a lot more detail in the book than it does in the film. But obviously, again, film narrative, you can't put everything in the book. We do get a little bit more recollection from the new Mrs. De Winter about her life before and after Manderley in the book. We don't really see that as much in the film. Now, the film then jumps straight to Mr. De Winter looking like he's about to jump, and our heroine sort of stopping him from going over. In the book, the next time that we sort of like the time that we see those two together, is more along the lines of when I'm gonna have to call her Mrs. De Winter because she literally doesn't have a name in the book. She literally, you never find out her actual name. So Mrs. De Winter sees him and he sits down and chats because of Mrs. Hooper, or Hopper. Hooper. It is Hooper. Now, so both we are in Monte Carlo, and our heroine is in the employ of Mrs. Van Hooper, who is a very outgoing woman, who corners Mr. De Winter in both the film and the book, and he seems to take a little shine to our female protagonist. But not to Mrs. Van Hooper, because she's not a very nice woman. Well, it's not that she's not a nice woman, it's just she knows exactly what she wants, and she gets it, so I think that puts a lot of people off. So Mrs. Van Hooper then comes down with an awful cold, which gives our protagonist the perfect free reign time, and she ends up spending the time with Mr. De Winter completely by accident almost, and then it grows and it grows, and obviously you see more in the book, well, you read more in the book of their relationship and how it grows. In the film you see it over, you know, a little short period of time, and you can see that there is something there, and you know, that's how they sort of like hit it off. So then, you know, I mean, it sort of starts, this whole thing is because our female protagonist goes down for lunch, knocks over a vase on her table and ends up lunching with Mr. De Winter, and then it kind of goes from there. So this is quite a nice start. So they fall in love with the time that they spend together, and then our female protagonist gets told that they'll be departing for New York straight away with Mrs. Van Hooper. So our female protagonist tries desperately to find Mr. De Winter, now Maxim to her, so she can say goodbye, fearing to never see him again. And in the book you kind of get this sort of like, this urgency, but it's kind of like over a longer period. In the film it's done like she's leaving the same day, and she's trying her hardest to get in touch with him, and he's out and he's doing this and he's doing that. Finally though, in both manages to get hold of Maxime. And then when she gets into Maxim and she says, you know, I'm being carted off to New York, you're never going to see me again, he basically says, marry me. Mrs. Van Hooper kind of looks her nose down at it, but doesn't say that she looks her nose down at it, and she's just sort of like, yeah, like, he'd want to marry you, you've got to be careful reaching above your class. Now, a big thing here, as I don't think I've mentioned it, is Mrs. De Winter, our female protagonist, Mrs. De Winter, is actually English in the book, but in the film it's American, and this is a huge difference that I don't know why they did it. So anyway, so you know, they then go off and they tell Mrs. Van Hooper that in actuality they're going to be married, and she won't be travelling to New York with her, and you know, Mrs. Van Hooper is like, oh yay, I'm so happy, and then to our female protagonist, she turns around and goes, I don't know what you're doing, you're an idiot. So our female friend has now become Mrs. De Winter by marrying Maxim in a rather hurried wedding in Monte Carlo, and they've now come back to Mandalay. Now they drive to Mandalay in the rain. I mean, it is England after all, what else were you expecting? I mean, I think, you know, we've had a couple of nice days of sun, but the majority, we've had some really lovely thunderstorms as well. So when they finally arrive, the rain has stopped, but Mrs. Danvers, the lady who runs the house for Mrs. De Winter, has gone against orders and have all the staff waiting to greet them. Now, straight away, that puts Mrs. De Winter at an edge, because she's never done this before. She doesn't greet the staff, she doesn't know what she's doing. And it kind of shows that Mrs. Danvers is wanting her to fail and is wanting everyone to know who she is and everything like that. Because she gives off this sort of like air of scorn towards the new Mrs. De Winter, who feels decidedly out of place, but Maxim doesn't see this. And he doesn't understand what's going on, because obviously to him it's exactly the same as it was before. So Mrs. Danvers then drops hints about how great the late Mrs. De Winter is, and how much she had a better room in the West Wing, and you know, she can see the sea and everything. And you get this feeling quite early on in both the film and the book that she is obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with Rebecca. It's creepy. I mean, like, I know she's like the head of the household and everything, but it just gets worse. So anyway, Maxim seems more present and loving in the book at times than he ever does in the film. He even offers to get rid of Mrs. Danvers at the beginning if it doesn't work out. They really should have taken him up on that. Really should have got rid of Mrs. Danvers a lot earlier than they did. But he seems rather distant in the film when they get back to Mandalay. Now, Mrs. De Winter is trying to get used to everything, but feels out of place and she feels foolish. She meets Maxim's sister and husband, who take a liking to her, and she gets on quite well. You see a lot more of their interaction in the book between the sister and Mrs. De Winter. You get that maybe once or twice in the film. You don't really see much else than that. So now the new Mrs. De Winter gets spooked quite a bit, and she seems rather frail in both. So she's kind of, obviously in the book it's more that you get the idea that she's having to go out and meet all these people and lunch with these people and get to know all these people that she never would have known before. But she does seem rather frail, and she seems like she's not got a backbone, and she seems really like a pushover and submissive. And I think this is again why it kind of annoyed me a little bit, because I get really annoyed when women are that submissive. But the time that the book was written, the time that the film was done, it does make sense. So I can't really get too annoyed about that, to be fair. So anyway, while going for a walk with Jasper and Maxim, Jasper runs off, and against Maxim's wishes, Mrs. De Winter runs after him. Now, that's when they come across this quaint little boathouse, which belonged to the late Mrs. De Winter. So belonged to Rebecca. I'm now going to call it Rebecca and Mrs. De Winter. It's a lot easier that way. So belonged to Rebecca. Now, she then meets this sort of like slow gentleman that works there, and, walks in. It's sort of like this untouched, sort of like completely furnished little mini house, pretty much. And then she goes back to Maxim, and he flips his lid, and he gets so annoyed and like really has a go at her for no reason. And so she gets really upset, and she's sort of like, oh, please forgive me, I love you, blah, 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 I didn't mean to upset you. Now, as I said, in the book as well, they seem to have a fair few more visitors to the house than they do in the film. And Mrs. De Winter also goes out to have a visit other people. Now, Mrs. De Winter finally finds out everything around Rebecca's death. But we also get the very strong presence of Rebecca everywhere and taunting everything. So basically, she knew that she drowned, but she didn't know really much else about that. So we finally get this sort of like, well, she went out to take the boat and she never came back, and then he went off and identified the body like 2 months later. It was bloated and disgusting and all of that. But you still get this ever presence like behind her. Everything she does, everything she says is completely just like judged by what Rebecca did and said. Now she does, however, seem to get rather well with Maxim's agent Frank, who really likes how refreshing she is and really can see that she's a good breath of fresh air and all of that. But then we get a scene where Mrs. De Winter accidentally smashes this like porcelain Cupid figurine, and it gets completely blown out of proportion. So basically, Mrs. Danvers then accuses Robert of stealing it, and then obviously they come in, and it turns out that Mrs. De Winter broke it, and Mrs. Danvers acts like she's dealing with a naughty child, and it's like, I can't believe you broke it, blah blah blah, and all of that. And I'm just sat there going, it's a Cupid figurine. Like, I'm pretty sure no one would have missed it. Well, obviously Mrs. Danvers missed it because Rebecca touched it. I forgot she's obsessed. Actually, you can't forget she's obsessed. It's completely always there. So then this is sort of like, this happens in both, and it's just ridiculous. I'm sorry, but it is. Because then it shows again Mrs. De Winter being submissive and upset and everything like that, and trying to make amends with the housekeeper pretty much. And it just doesn't quite fit with what she should be doing. So Mrs. Danvers then finds out and makes snarky comments about everything. And then Maxim then chides Mrs. De Winter, and then she admits that she's afraid of Mrs. Danvers. And instead of Maxim backing her up, he goes, stop being a child. She is basically a child. You married her because she's young. Maxim is gruff and aloof at times, and Mrs. De Winter is naive and sometimes simpering woman that just wants to please him, very much like a puppy dog. And this is very present in both. This is very present in both the film and the book narrative. In fact, I would go so far as to say Mrs. De Winter is very codependent on Maxim, and she probably couldn't survive on her own. So then Maxim goes to London, and Mrs. De Winter spots Mrs. Danvers and a gentleman called Mr. Favell sneaking around the West Wing, which was where Rebecca used to stay. So she feels uncomfortable with the situation. She tries to hide. Mr. Favell finds her. They sort of get introduced. He says he's the cousin. There's obviously something going on there that's a little bit deeper, because she can tell that Mrs. Danvers is very unhappy with what's happened. So then once Mr. Favell finally leaves, Mrs. De Winter then goes to the West Wing to investigate what Mrs. Danvers may have been doing, and discovers Rebecca's room perfectly kept as if she was going to come back literally the same day. And then this is how we see how obsessed Mrs. Danvers really was with Rebecca. We see the disdain from Mrs. Danvers, because she goes through all the coats and the hairbrushes and the nightie and everything, and goes, and this is what would happen, and this is what would happen, and don't think that, you know, for a second he's happy with you. And it's like, wow, she's horrible. I would literally at this point be like, go, I don't want you here. We do also see as well in the book, we see Maxim's sister and Mrs. De Winter going to visit his grandmother, Maxim's grandmother, which never happens in the film. And it's quite a nice little thing, because again, we see this presence of Rebecca, where the grandmother's just like, well, where's Rebecca? I want Rebecca. What, you know, not realising that this is the new Mrs. De Winter and Rebecca's been dead for a year. But then we've got the ball. Now, the ball gets discussed because people come to visit the house and push for it in the book. So Jack and Maxim take it on. In the film, Mrs. De Winter begs Maxim for the chance to do the ball, and she does it all herself. She does her costume and everything herself. Now, in both, Mrs. De Winter is struggling to think of a costume, so Mrs. Danvers suggests a costume for Mrs. De Winter from a portrait in the gallery. So Mrs. De Winter goes, oh, that'd be really good, and she keeps it a complete surprise. However, surely you'd think, Mrs. Danvers, past history, does she really want to be helpful? No, she doesn't. So when Mrs. De Winter unveils her dress, Maxim goes icy cold, tells her to change, becomes like a horrible human being. You know, Mrs. De Winter, not knowing what's going on, goes off crying to her room and spots Mrs. Danvers on the way with an evil grin on her face, stood in the West Wing where Rebecca's room was. So it turns out Rebecca used the same outfit in the last ball before she died. So Mrs. Danvers ain't daft. She knows what she's doing. So Mrs. De Winter eventually changes into something else and walks around the house, and then joins the party in the book. In the film, she doesn't really join the party. However, in both, she goes into the West Wing to confront Mrs. Danvers. They have a conversation, and Mrs. Danvers kind of urges her almost to commit suicide, pretty much, to jump out a window to end it all, because she's not good enough. She never will be. Maxim doesn't love her. He's only in love with Rebecca. She's just, and it's a horrible, horrible woman. And it's only because there is this sort of like signal given off by the ship that's gone aground that Mrs. De Winter gets snapped out of what she's thinking, and she decides that she's not going to jump, thank God. Now, they're then trying to free, so when they're trying to free the boat, divers go down because this boat has run aground. They're trying to free this boat. The divers go down and they find Mrs. De Winter's, Rebecca's boat with a body on board. So if Rebecca's on board, who on earth did they verify? So then Mrs. De Winter then comes across Maxim in Rebecca's boathouse in the film, but in the book it's in their actual house, and finds out the truth of what happened. So Rebecca was cheating. Maxim didn't love her. She pushed him to a point where he snapped and he pushed her. Due to a wound, he died. Due to a wound, she died, but he didn't kill her in the film. In the book, same thing. Rebecca was cheating. Maxim didn't love her. She pushes him. He shoots her, though, point blank, kills her, takes out the boat and scuttles it. He takes out the boat and scuttles it in both. Now, the body he identified months later was some random person, and that's it. Now, despite this reveal, Mrs. De Winter sticks by his side and insists they can beat the inquiry and have happiness. So Maxim finally admits that he truly loves Mrs. De Winter and never loved Rebecca. So then the truth comes out. Mrs. De Winter comes up with a plan to play dumb, act like you actually thought it was Rebecca's body they identified. And then they seem to become even closer from that, sort of like becoming a close-knit unit. Then there comes the inquest where the boat is raised and Rebecca found to be dead. At the inquest, everything is going smoothly until the boat builder mentions that it was scuttled and deliberately sunk. So in the book, Mrs. De Winter goes back to Mandalay, and then Maxim comes in saying they decided suicide and that the real Rebecca would be just buried later. In the film, Favell believes Maxim killed her, tries to blackmail him, but then they get the police involved to try and prove him as guilty. Now, in the book, after the verdict of suicide, Favell comes to the house and tries to blackmail Maxim due to his guilt. They then call the magistrate, and Favell tries to sway the verdict from suicide to murder. Now, in the film, they get hold of the doctor who was seeing Rebecca to prove she wasn't suicidal, and they think she was pregnant, because obviously motive. It turns out she had cancer, so we know that she pushed Maxim to kill her so she wouldn't waste away. Now, in the book, with everyone at the house, they pull forward to try and act as... They pull forward Ben, who's the sort of the slow person, to try and act as witness to the murder of Rebecca. He comes up with nothing, so they call Mrs. Danvers. She comes up with nothing. They then manage to find out about the doctor. They go on an errand to find out where he lives, you know, and why she was seeing him. They find out it's cancer. Suicide is then underlined. Definitely did it. So the film ends with Favell telling Mrs. Danvers, what happened and that Rebecca was dying of cancer. So Mrs. Danvers burns Manderley to the ground, dying in the process, but then the De Winters being very happy and moving on with their life. Now the book ends very abruptly with Manderley burning, but that is all. We don't see any of the aftermath or anything like that. They literally just see burning on the horizon and that's it. That's the last line. Now the plot was very close to the book. They took all the key points and even did the shadow of Rebecca very well. I love the way that they showed Rebecca's true nature as more and more truths came to light. She was awful, not loved, she had cancer, she was a horrible human being. And the new Mrs. De Winter started to become stronger and more assertive. She ends up with more of a backbone. Now, they did change the ending around a little, and I do understand why they gave that little scene after the burning to sort of show the happiness. But for the plot, it gets a 7 out of 10 for me. It was very spot on, very close. Now, overall, the settings were the same. The impressiveness of Mrs. Danvers using the memory of Rebecca was well done. The characters all seemed rather spot on. And honestly, I think Hitchcock did an amazing job of adapting this book to the film. Now, he did lose a bit more of the feeling of the book, but obviously it's to make sure that the film progresses a lot quicker and a lot more succinctly. So overall, I think it gets an 8 out of 10 for me. Now, this is my own opinion, of course, as I say every week. If you agree or disagree, leave it below in the comments. Let me know as well if there's a book to film adaptation you'd like me to do, but don't forget to click subscribe so you're alerted whenever a new video becomes available. Don't forget to join me next week for my contented narrative around The Devil Wears Prada. But until then, remember to always keep it contento.